Chapter 1. Aegean Whispers. The sea stretched endlessly, a mirror of turquoise broken only by the occasional white crest of a wave. The sound of the water was constant, a rhythm as old as time itself, echoing softly against the cliffs that rose like sentinels from the Aegean. Perched atop one of those cliffs was a small village, a cluster of whitewashed homes and terracotta roofs that seemed to grow organically from the rocky outcrop. In the heart of this village stood a house that had seen better days. Its walls bore the gentle cracks of age, and its shutters creaked in the wind like a whispered lament. This was the home of Calliope, a young woman with a heart that yearned for something she could not name. Calliope spent her mornings at the edge of the cliff, a wicker basket by her side as she gathered sprigs of thyme and oregano from the wild growth. Her dark hair, kissed by the sun, tumbled down her back in loose waves, and her olive skin bore the warmth of someone who had lived beneath these skies her entire life. Yet, for all the beauty of her surroundings, there was a restlessness in her gaze, a longing that no one in the village could quite understand. The villagers spoke in hushed tones about Calliope's lineage. Her mother had been a foreigner, a woman of mystery who had arrived on the island one stormy night and left as abruptly as she had come. Calliope's father, a fisherman, had raised her alone until the sea claimed him one fateful evening. Since then, she had lived in the old house, tending to the herbs her father had planted and weaving the nets he had left behind. Today, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, Calliope felt the pull of the sea more strongly than ever. She left her basket behind and made her way down the winding path that led to the shore. The path was steep and treacherous, but her feet knew the way as if guided by an invisible thread. The beach below was secluded, a hidden cove embraced by towering cliffs. Here, the sea was calmer, its whispers more intimate. Calliope waded into the water, letting the cool waves lap at her ankles. She closed her eyes and listened, not to the sound of the sea, but to the silence beneath it. It was in that silence that she felt closest to her father, as if his spirit lingered in the water that had claimed him. But today, there was something different about the cove. A faint glimmer caught her eye, a flash of light beneath the surface. She knelt and peered into the water, her heart quickening as she reached for the object. It was a pendant, tarnished with age but still beautiful. A small, intricately carved seashell hung from a delicate chain. Calliope turned it over in her hands, her fingers brushing against an inscription so faint it was almost invisible. She held it to the light and read the words etched into the metal. "To my love, forever bound by the sea." A shiver ran through her, though the sun was warm on her skin. The pendant felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried not just metal but memory. Whose love had it symbolized? Whose hand had it slipped from, lost to the waves? Calliope stood, her mind buzzing with questions, and tucked the pendant into the pocket of her dress. The sea seemed to hum with an energy she couldn't explain, its whispers now louder, more insistent. She felt as though she had stepped into a story that had begun long before her birth, a tale written in salt and sun. As she climbed back up the path to the village, the pendant pressed against her thigh with each step, a constant reminder of the discovery she could not yet understand. Behind her, the waves surged and fell, their whispers carrying secrets that waited to be unveiled. Chapter 2. The Echo of Broken Waves. The pendant lingered in Calliope's thoughts like the shadow of a cloud passing over the Aegean, its presence subtle yet undeniable. That night, as the village surrendered to slumber and the moon cast its silver gaze upon the world, she sat by the small window of her room, the chain coiled in her palm. The inscription glimmered faintly in the moonlight, a whisper etched in metal. Calliope had always believed in the stories woven through the fabric of her village. Tales of gods who once walked the earth, of lovers turned to stone by jealousy, of seas that could both cradle and consume. Yet, holding the pendant, she felt an unfamiliar sensation, as though this artifact carried with it the weight of something real, something tangible. The night air drifted through the window, carrying with it the scent of salt and wildflowers. Somewhere in the distance, the faint notes of a lyre echoed, a melody played by a wandering soul. Calliope traced the curves of the pendant with her fingertips, wondering what had drawn it to her. The next morning, the sky was heavy with clouds, and the sea was restless, its waves crashing against the cliffs with a force that sent sprays of foam into the air. The village stirred cautiously, as though sensing the mood of the elements. Calliope rose with the dawn, slipping the pendant into a small pouch that she fastened around her neck. She set out toward the market, her woven basket swinging lightly at her side. The cobblestone streets were slick with mist, and the scent of freshly baked bread mingled with the brine of the sea. As she passed the familiar stalls, laden with ripe olives, sun-dried tomatoes, and fragrant herbs, her mind wandered back to the inscription. Near the edge of the market stood a weathered stall adorned with trinkets and baubles. It belonged to Sophia, an elderly woman known for her collection of oddities gathered from across the islands. Sophia rarely spoke, her gaze sharp and discerning as she observed the ebb and flow of life in the village. Calliope approached the stall hesitantly, her fingers brushing against the pouch hidden beneath her blouse. She studied the array of items on display: ancient coins, chipped ceramics, and fragments of sea glass, each one carrying the weight of a forgotten story. Drawn by an inexplicable pull, she picked up a small shard of pottery painted with a faint image of the sea. It was then that a sharp gust of wind swept through the market, scattering leaves and appending baskets. Calliope stumbled, clutching the pouch instinctively. The pendant pressed against her skin, cool and reassuring. The villagers muttered about omens and bad luck as they hurried to gather their belongings. Calliope, however, felt a strange clarity in the chaos, as though the wind had spoken a language only she could hear. She returned the shard to the stall and made her way toward the cliffs, her heart pounding in rhythm with the crashing waves. The path to the cove was slick with rain, but Calliope's steps were sure. She reached the shore just as the storm broke, the heavens unleashing their fury in sheets of rain. The pendant seemed to grow warmer against her skin, its presence almost alive. She knelt by the water's edge, the waves lapping hungrily at her knees. Pulling the pendant from its pouch, she held it out toward the sea, her breath caught between awe and fear. The water surged suddenly, a wave breaking higher than the rest and soaking her to the bone. In the churning foam, she thought she saw a shape, a flicker of movement that vanished as quickly as it appeared. She blinked, uncertain whether it had been real or a trick of the light. The storm raged on, but Calliope felt no urge to seek shelter. Instead, she stood, the pendant clenched tightly in her hand, and stared out at the vast expanse of water. Something was calling to her, something ancient and unyielding. The pendant, she realized, was not merely a relic. It was a key. To what? She did not know. But the echo of broken waves seemed to hold the answer. As the storm began to wane, Calliope turned back toward the village, her clothes heavy with rain and her mind even heavier with questions. Behind her, the sea roared its approval, as if pleased that she had heard its call. Chapter 3: Marble Hearts Beneath the Sun. The morning after the storm broke, the village seemed reborn under the brilliant Greek sun. Every surface shimmered as if polished by the heavens, the cobblestones still damp but gleaming, the sea now a placid mirror reflecting the sky. Life resumed its rhythm, with fishermen casting their nets and women hanging laundered linens that billowed like sails in the breeze. But Calliope moved through the village as if in a dream, her thoughts tethered to the pendant now resting against her skin. The storm had left more than just soaked clothing and restless dreams. It had left her with an insatiable curiosity, a hunger that no mundane task could satisfy. She found herself drawn, almost magnetically, to the old ruins that lay just beyond the village, a remnant of the past whispered about by elders and avoided by the cautious. The ruins had once been a temple, or so the stories claimed. Now, it was little more than a cluster of broken columns and scattered marble slabs, overrun by wildflowers and the persistent hum of bees. To the villagers, it was a place of ghosts and forgotten gods, a site to be revered but not disturbed. To Calliope, it felt like a gateway, though to what, she could not say. The path to the ruins was steep and winding, carved into the side of the cliff. Calliope's sandals scuffed against the rocky terrain as she climbed, the pendant growing warmer with each step. When she finally reached the top, she paused to catch her breath, her gaze sweeping over the landscape. The sea stretched endlessly before her, a vast expanse of blue that seemed to pulse with life. Behind her, the village nestled snugly against the hillside, its whitewashed walls glowing in the sunlight. She stepped into the ruins, her footsteps muffled by the soft carpet of moss and wildflowers. The air here was different, still and heavy, as if the place itself were holding its breath. The remnants of columns stood like sentinels, their surfaces etched with faint carvings worn smooth by time. Calliope wandered through the ruins, her fingers brushing against the cool marble. She felt a strange sense of familiarity, as though she had been here before in another life. The pendant seemed to hum against her chest, its presence almost insistent. She reached for it, pulling it from beneath her blouse and holding it up to the light. The inscription glinted faintly in the sun, the words now etched into her mind, "To my love, forever bound by the sea." She knelt beside one of the larger slabs, her fingers tracing the grooves carved into its surface. To her astonishment, she recognized the same symbol that adorned the pendant, a spiral, delicate yet intricate, like the shell of a nautilus. Her pulse quickened. The pendant wasn't just an isolated relic. It was part of something larger, something that tied her to this place. She leaned closer, brushing away the dirt and moss that clung to the stone. Beneath the grime, she uncovered a series of faint markings, lines and curves that formed what appeared to be a map. The realization hit her like a wave. The ruins were not merely a forgotten temple. They were a key, a guide to something hidden. But what? And why had the pendant come to her? As the sun climbed higher, its rays casting long shadows across the ruins, Calliope felt a surge of determination. She would uncover the truth, no matter where it led. The pendant had chosen her for a reason, and she would honor its silent call. She spent hours exploring the ruins, her hands growing raw from scraping away layers of dirt and stone. With each discovery, a fragment of pottery here, a faint carving there. She felt the threads of the past weaving themselves into her present. By the time she descended the hill, the sun was beginning its slow descent, casting the landscape in hues of gold and amber. Calliope's body ached from the effort, but her mind buzzed with possibilities. She carried with her not just the pendant, but the weight of a secret that demanded to be revealed. As she returned to the village, the sea murmured in the distance, its whispers a constant reminder of the journey she had only just begun. Beneath the setting sun, the ruins stood silent and eternal, their marble hearts glowing faintly in the fading light. Chapter 4: Sands of Yesterday. The following day dawned with a curious stillness. The sea was calm, its surface rippling gently beneath the early sunlight, and the village seemed caught in a strange, suspended moment, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Calliope awoke with the weight of the ruins and the pendant heavy on her mind. The memory of the spiral carvings and the faint map etched into the stone haunted her dreams and lingered in her waking thoughts. Her morning routine felt distant, her actions mechanical as she swept the small kitchen, fed the lone stray cat that lingered by her door, and plaited her hair with practiced ease. The pendant, tucked safely beneath her blouse, pressed against her skin as though urging her onward. By midday, she found herself standing at the edge of the village, staring out at the stretch of beach that curved around the cliffside. The tide was low, exposing a bed of golden sand streaked with darker veins of volcanic rock. It was here that the villagers claimed the ancients had first arrived, stepping ashore from their long-forgotten ships and marking the land with their presence. The beach felt untouched by time. Each grain of sand, each jagged rock, seemed to carry the weight of centuries. Calliope moved slowly, her bare feet sinking into the cool sand as she followed the tide's edge. The water lapped at her ankles, warm and inviting, as though beckoning her closer. As she walked, she began to notice fragments scattered along the shore. Broken pieces of pottery, smoothed by the waves, lay nestled among the rocks. She bent to pick one up, her fingers tracing the faint design painted on its surface, a spiral, just like the one carved into the ruins. Her pulse quickened. The pieces were small, but they seemed deliberate, as though left behind by someone who had walked this same path centuries ago. She gathered a handful of fragments, cradling them in her hands as she moved further down the beach. The air grew warmer, the sun climbing higher into the sky. Calliope's shadow stretched long before her, a silent companion in her search. The pendant felt heavier against her chest, its presence almost alive. She paused near a cluster of rocks that jutted out into the sea, their surfaces slick with moss and algae. It was there, among the shadows of the rocks, that she saw it, a glint of something metallic, half buried in the sand. She knelt, brushing away the grains with careful hands, and uncovered a small, rusted box. The box was simple in design, its edges worn smooth by time and water. A faint symbol was etched into its lid, the same spiral that had begun to haunt her every step. Calliope's heart raced as she pried the lid open, revealing its contents. Inside was a single piece of parchment, its edges frayed and its surface faded. The writing was delicate, almost too faint to read, but Calliope's eyes were drawn to the same inscription that adorned the pendant, "To my love, forever bound by the sea." Beneath the words was a sketch, a map, more detailed than the one in the ruins, with markings that seemed to trace a path from the cliffs to the sea. The map's lines wove intricately, leading to a point just beyond the rocks where Calliope knelt. She stared at it, the realization settling over her like a tide. Whatever the pendant and ruins had been leading her toward, it lay somewhere beneath the waves. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. The sea was vast, its depths unknowable and filled with secrets that had swallowed countless lives. And yet, she felt no fear. Instead, there was a strange sense of calm, a certainty that this was her path. Calliope stood, the box clutched tightly in her hands, and gazed out at the horizon. The water sparkled in the sunlight, its surface serene, betraying nothing of what lay beneath. She knew she would return to the beach, to the ruins, and eventually to the depths of the sea itself. The journey was hers alone, written in the sands of yesterday and whispered by the waves. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the beach in hues of amber and gold, Calliope turned back toward the village. The fragments of pottery and the rusted box felt like pieces of a puzzle she was only beginning to understand. Behind her, the waves rolled gently onto the shore, their whispers growing softer as the tide began to rise. Chapter 5. Threads of an Ancient Promise. The days that followed were a blur of preparation and restless energy. Calliope moved through the village with a purpose she could not fully explain. her thoughts consumed by the map she had discovered in the rusted box. The lines and symbols etched into the parchment had become as familiar to her as the veins on her hands, each one pulling her closer to the sea. Her evenings were spent studying the map under the dim light of a single candle, her fingers tracing its intricate patterns. She marked the location where the lines converged just beyond the rocks, a spot she had stared at countless times from the safety of the shore. But now, that place felt less like a destination and more like a beginning. On the morning she decided to descend into the water, the sky was painted in soft hues of lavender and gold. The village was still, its inhabitants only just beginning to stir. Calliope slipped out of her small home, her sandals barely making a sound against the cobblestones. The pendant hung heavily around her neck, its weight both a comfort and a reminder of the journey ahead. The beach was empty when she arrived, the tide low and the air thick with the scent of salt. She stood at the water's edge, her feet sinking into the cool sand, and stared out at the horizon. The sea was calm, its surface shimmering in the early light, but she could feel the power that lay beneath its tranquil exterior. Calliope stepped into the water, her movements slow and deliberate. The waves lapped at her ankles, then her knees, as she waded deeper. The pendant grew warmer against her skin, as though urging her onward. When the water reached her waist, she paused, her breath hitching as she gazed down into the depths. The sea was deceptively clear, its depths revealing a bed of rocks and sand that seemed to stretch endlessly. She clutched the pendant, its smooth surface cool despite its warmth, and took a deep breath. With a final glance at the shore, she dove beneath the waves. The world beneath the surface was a realm of muted light and endless blue. The water was cool against her skin, her movements fluid as she propelled herself deeper. She followed the map in her mind, the memory of its lines guiding her as surely as the pendant's pull. As she swam, the sea seemed to come alive around her. Schools of fish darted past, their scales catching the sunlight that filtered through the water. A lone octopus curled its tentacles around a rock, watching her with unblinking eyes. Calliope felt a strange sense of belonging, as though she were not merely a visitor but a part of this underwater world. It was then that she saw it, a shadow in the distance, faint but unmistakable. She swam closer, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadow resolved into a structure, its edges softened by time and the sea's relentless embrace. It was a doorway, carved from stone and adorned with the same spiral symbols that had haunted her journey. The doorway stood tall and imposing, its surface covered in barnacles and seaweed. Calliope hesitated, her gaze lingering on the carvings that seemed to pulse with an energy of their own. The pendant burned against her chest, urging her forward. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the stone. The moment her skin made contact, the sea seemed to still around her. The water grew impossibly quiet, and for a moment, Calliope felt as though she were suspended in a void. Then, a sound emerged, a low, melodic hum that seemed to resonate through her very bones. It was unlike anything she had ever heard, a song that spoke of longing and loss, of love that transcended time. The doorway began to glow faintly, its carvings illuminated by a soft, ethereal light. Calliope stepped through the doorway, her movements slow and deliberate. On the other side was a cavern, its walls lined with smooth stones that shimmered faintly in the light. The water here was warm, its currents gentle as they swirled around her. In the center of the cavern stood a pedestal, its surface adorned with spirals and intricate designs. Atop the pedestal rested a small, glass orb, its surface smooth and glowing with the same light as the doorway. Calliope approached it, her breath catching as she reached out to touch it. The moment her fingers made contact, the orb pulsed with light, and the pendant around her neck grew impossibly warm. A vision flooded her mind, a flash of images and emotions that left her breathless. She saw a man and a woman standing by the sea, their hands entwined as they gazed at the horizon. She felt their love, their sorrow, their unbreakable bond. When the vision faded, Calliope found herself back on the shore, the orb clutched tightly in her hand. The pendant was cool against her skin, its warmth gone, but its presence no less powerful. She stared out at the horizon, the sea calm once more, and felt a strange sense of peace. She knew her journey was far from over. The orb was a piece of the puzzle, a fragment of a story that had yet to fully reveal itself. But for now, she would rest, the song of the waves echoing in her mind as she prepared for the next chapter of her journey. Chapter 6: The Vineyard's Hidden Sorrows. The orb weighed in Calliope's hands like a piece of eternity, its faint glow undimmed by the bright afternoon sun. She sat on the shore, her feet buried in the warm sand as she stared at the horizon. The pendant around her neck rested cold now, its fiery urgency spent, but she could still feel its pull. Together, the orb and the pendant seemed to hum with a silent, shared energy, a resonance that bound them both to the sea and, somehow, to her. The vision from the cavern lingered in her mind, a swirl of love and sorrow so vivid that it felt like a memory of her own. She could still see the man and woman by the sea, their hands entwined, their faces turned toward the endless blue. Who were they? And why did their story feel so achingly familiar? Calliope closed her eyes and let the sound of the waves wash over her. The sea whispered its secrets in a language she couldn't quite understand but felt deeply. Somewhere beneath its surface lay answers, she was certain of it. But for now, she needed time to think, to piece together the fragments of the puzzle that had found their way into her life. She carried the orb back to her small home, cradling it like a fragile treasure. Once inside, she set it on the wooden table and sat before it, her hands resting in her lap. The orb pulsed faintly, its light casting gentle shadows on the walls. Calliope reached for the map she had found in the rusted box, spreading it out beside the orb. Her fingers traced the lines and symbols, searching for meaning in their delicate patterns. The map had led her to the doorway beneath the sea, but it also hinted at something more. A path that extended beyond the ruins and into the heart of the island. Her gaze shifted to the pendant, its spiral design a constant reminder of the journey she had begun. The spiral was everywhere. In the ruins, on the map, even in the markings on the orb. It was as if the symbol held the key to understanding everything, a cipher waiting to be unlocked. Calliope leaned back in her chair, the late afternoon light streaming through the window and painting the room in shades of gold. Her mind wandered to the villagers' stories, the whispered tales of the ancients who had come to these shores long ago. They spoke of gods and lovers, of tragedies that had left their marks on the land and sea. She thought of the ruins on the cliff, the carvings that seemed to pulse with life beneath her touch. Perhaps the answers lay not just in the sea but in the past, in the stories that had been passed down through generations. The next morning, Calliope set out early, her footsteps light on the cobblestones as she made her way to the village square. The elders often gathered there, their voices low and steady as they recounted tales of the island's history. She had always listened from a distance, hesitant to interrupt, but today she felt a new determination. As the sun climbed higher, the village came to life around her. Fishermen hauled in their nets, children chased each other through the narrow streets, and the scent of freshly baked bread filled the air. Calliope made her way to the square, her heart pounding with anticipation. The elders sat in their usual spot beneath the shade of a large olive tree, their faces weathered but kind. She approached cautiously, her steps faltering as she reached the edge of the circle. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure of how to begin. But then she remembered the vision, the man and woman by the sea, their love etched into the very fabric of the island. She thought of the orb and the pendant, the way they seemed to call to her with a voice only she could hear. Her resolve strengthened. She knelt before the elders, the pendant warm against her chest and the memory of the sea's song in her mind. Chapter 7. Between the Olive Trees. Calliope's days had always been marked by the rhythm of the village, the soft murmur of the sea, the laughter of children chasing each other in the narrow streets, and the quiet pride of fishermen returning with their day's catch. But now, her world felt different, as if an invisible thread were pulling her towards something vast and unseen. The pendant around her neck, the orb resting safely at home, and the vision of the lovers by the sea, all were pieces of a tapestry she could not yet fully grasp. The elders' stories from the previous day lingered in her mind like a haunting melody. Their voices had been soft and slow, carrying the weight of centuries as they recounted tales of the island's ancient past. They spoke of temples built to honor forgotten gods, of rituals performed at the edge of the sea, and of love so profound it had left an imprint on the land itself. One story stood out among the others, weaving itself into Calliope's thoughts with an unrelenting urgency. It was a tale of two lovers, bound by the sea and separated by the wrath of the gods. According to legend, they had sought to escape their fate, leaving behind a trail of symbols and artifacts to guide those who came after them. The elders believed these symbols were scattered across the island, hidden in places where the sea and land converged. Calliope found herself drawn back to the ruins on the cliff, the place where her journey had begun. The path was steep and winding, the rocks sharp beneath her sandals, but she moved with purpose, the pendant warm against her chest as if urging her forward. The midday sun beat down on her shoulders, its heat softened by a gentle breeze that carried the scent of salt and wild thyme. When she reached the ruins, the air seemed to shift, growing heavier with a sense of reverence. The carvings in the stone glowed faintly in the sunlight, their spirals and lines weaving patterns that seemed almost alive. Calliope approached the central altar, her fingers brushing against its surface. The stone was cool beneath her touch, its texture rough and weathered. As she traced the carvings, a memory stirred within her. Not her own, but something older, deeper. She saw flashes of images. A woman standing on this very spot, her dark hair blowing in the wind, and a man kneeling before her, their hands entwined as they whispered silent vows. Calliope pulled her hand away, her breath catching in her throat. The vision faded, leaving behind a sense of longing that settled deep in her chest. She turned her attention back to the altar, her eyes scanning its surface for clues. The spiral seemed to form a path, their lines leading toward the edge of the ruins where the cliff dropped steeply into the sea. Carefully, she followed the carvings, her steps slow and deliberate. The pendant grew warmer as she moved closer to the cliff's edge, its weight a steady presence against her chest. When she reached the end of the path, she stopped, her gaze drawn to a narrow crevice in the rock. The crevice was barely wide enough for her to fit through, its entrance hidden by a tangle of wild vines. Calliope hesitated for only a moment before pushing the vines aside and stepping into the darkness. The air inside was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of earth and sea. The passageway was narrow, its walls smooth and damp beneath her fingertips. She moved carefully, her footsteps echoing softly as she descended deeper into the cliff. The pendant's warmth guided her, its steady pulse a silent reassurance in the darkness. At last, the passageway opened into a cavern, its walls glowing faintly with bioluminescent moss. The light reflected off a shallow pool at the cavern's center, its surface rippling gently as if stirred by an unseen force. Calliope approached the pool, her gaze drawn to its depths. Beneath the water lay another carving, its lines sharp and precise despite the passage of time. The spiral symbol was there again, surrounded by a series of smaller markings that formed a pattern she didn't recognize. She knelt beside the pool, her fingers brushing the water's surface. The pendant grew hot against her skin, its warmth spreading through her chest as the carvings beneath the water began to glow. The air grew heavy, the cavern filling with a low, melodic hum that seemed to resonate through the very stones. Calliope closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. It was the same song she had heard in the doorway beneath the sea, a melody that spoke of love and loss, of a bond that transcended time. When she opened her eyes, the markings beneath the water had changed, their shapes rearranging to form a map, a continuation of the one she had found in the rusted box. The map led further inland, its lines tracing a path through the heart of the island. Calliope committed the new markings to memory, her mind already racing with the possibilities that lay ahead. As she left the cavern and stepped back into the sunlight, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The sea and the land were working together, guiding her toward the truth. Each step brought her closer to the lover's story, a tale written in stone, sand, and waves. Chapter 8. The Heart of the Island. The morning light was soft, diffused through the mist that clung to the hills like a gauzy veil. Calliope stood at the edge of the forest, her breath visible in the crisp air as she gazed at the path ahead. The map she had memorized from the cavern was clear in her mind, its lines etched into her thoughts as surely as if they had been drawn there by the gods themselves. The pendant around her neck hummed with a quiet energy, its spiral design glowing faintly as if to reassure her. The orb, safely wrapped in cloth and tucked into her satchel, carried its own weight of mystery. Together, they felt like guardians of an ancient story, one she was now bound to uncover. Calliope stepped into the forest, her sandals crunching softly against the leaves and twigs that carpeted the ground. The trees arched overhead, their branches entwined to form a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the earth below. The air was alive with the scent of pine and earth, a sharp contrast to the salt-laden breezes of the shore. The path wound upward, climbing steadily toward the island's interior. The map's markings had indicated a series of landmarks, natural formations that would guide her to the place where the lines converged, the heart of the island. She scanned her surroundings carefully, her eyes seeking the first marker. It wasn't long before she found it. A towering oak with a trunk so wide it would take 3 people to encircle it. Its bark was etched with symbols, spirals and lines that mirrored the carvings she had seen in the ruins and beneath the sea. Calliope placed her hand against the tree, feeling the rough texture beneath her fingertips. The pendant grew warmer, its energy coursing through her like an electric current. She continued onward, the path becoming steeper and more rugged. Her legs ached with the effort, but she pressed on, driven by a sense of urgency she couldn't quite explain. The forest grew denser, the light dimming as the canopy thickened overhead. The second marker appeared as she rounded a bend. A boulder split cleanly in two, its surface covered in moss except for a single, unmistakable spiral carved into its face. Calliope paused to catch her breath, her hand brushing against the carving as she leaned against the stone. The air around her seemed to change, growing heavier with the weight of unseen eyes. It wasn't an unwelcome feeling. Rather, it was as if the forest itself were watching her, silently urging her forward. The third marker was the most striking of all, a small, crystal-clear stream that cut through the path, its waters sparkling like liquid light. On the far bank stood a statue, its surface worn smooth by time, but still recognizable as a depiction of a woman. Her arms were outstretched, her face tilted upward as if in prayer or supplication. Calliope crossed the stream carefully, her sandals slipping on the slick stones beneath the water. She stood before the statue, her gaze drawn to the spiral carved into its chest. The symbol seemed to pulse faintly, its rhythm matching the beat of her heart. Beyond the statue, the forest began to thin, the trees giving way to a meadow bathed in golden sunlight. At its center stood a stone circle, the kind Calliope had only seen in history books. The stones were massive, their surfaces covered in the same intricate carvings that had guided her this far. As she approached the circle, the pendant grew hotter, its glow intensifying until it was nearly blinding. Calliope hesitated at the edge of the meadow, her breath catching in her throat as she took in the scene before her. The stones seemed to hum with energy, their presence both ancient and alive. She stepped into the circle, the pendant's heat radiating through her chest like a second heartbeat. At the center of the circle was an altar, smaller than the one at the cliffside ruins, but similar in design. The orb in her satchel began to vibrate, its energy resonating with the stones around her. Calliope placed the orb on the altar, her hands trembling as she unwrapped it from its cloth. The moment it touched the stone, the carvings on the altar began to glow, their light spreading outward until it enveloped the entire circle. The hum grew louder, transforming into a melody that filled the air like the sound of a distant choir. Calliope closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. She felt as though she were being drawn into the stones, her body and spirit merging with the energy that surrounded her. When she opened her eyes, the meadow was gone. She stood on a vast plain of light, the horizon stretching endlessly in all directions. The air was warm and still, the light soft and golden. Before her stood the figures from her vision, the man and woman whose love had bound them to the island. They were not flesh and blood, but something else, their forms shimmering like the surface of a sunlit sea. They reached out to her, their hands extended as if offering her something unseen. Calliope stepped forward, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and wonder. The moment she touched their hands, the plane dissolved, and she was back in the stone circle. The orb had dimmed, its light reduced to a faint glow, but the carvings on the altar remained lit. In the center of the spiral was a new symbol, one she hadn't seen before, a key. Chapter 9. Beneath a Midnight Sky. The journey had taken on a new urgency. The key that Calliope had uncovered at the heart of the island was no ordinary symbol. It pulsed with an energy she could feel deep within her chest, as if it were calling to her from a place beyond the reach of time. The stone circle had offered her a glimpse of something greater, something ancient and far-reaching. But the vision had left her with more questions than answers. She left the meadow with a heavy heart, the light of the stone circle fading behind her as she made her way back through the dense forest. Her footsteps were steady, but her mind raced. She could feel the weight of the key pressing against her thoughts, urging her to understand. The symbols, the pendant, the orb. These were all pieces of a puzzle she was only beginning to comprehend. The forest was quieter now, the song of the birds replaced by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The air seemed to thicken as she descended the narrow path, the familiar surroundings of the village beginning to appear on the horizon. But Calliope knew that she couldn't return yet, not until she had unlocked the secrets that had drawn her here. She glanced at the pendant around her neck, its spiral gleaming faintly against the backdrop of the forest. She had begun to understand its connection to the island's history, but the key was the missing piece, a fragment that had been hidden for centuries, waiting for her to find it. The map she had followed to the stone circle had led her to this point, but it was not finished. The lines had not yet converged. The path led her back to the cliffs, the place where it had all begun. The wind had picked up, whipping through the trees and carrying the scent of salt and seaweed. She paused at the edge, looking out over the water. The waves crashed against the rocks below, their rhythmic pulse a constant presence, as if they were marking time. Calliope's eyes wandered to the horizon, where the ocean met the sky in a seamless line. The sea was both beautiful and terrifying in its vastness, a reminder of the power that lay just beyond the land. It was a place of both beginnings and endings, where stories were born and lost with each passing tide. The key had shown her something beyond the physical world, an unseen realm where the lovers' souls still lingered. She felt it now, the pull of their love reaching out to her, as if it were calling her to return to the places she had seen in her vision. But there was still one final piece to uncover. She retraced her steps, making her way back to the ruins on the cliffside. The sun was setting as she approached, casting a warm golden glow over the landscape. The air was cool now, carrying the scent of earth and stone. She stood before the altar once more, the faint glow of the spiral still visible in the stone. The key, she realized, was not meant to be understood alone. It was a part of something larger, something that stretched beyond the limits of time and memory. The symbols carved into the stone were a language of the gods, an ancient dialect that had been lost to history. But the key would unlock it. Calliope placed the pendant on the altar, her fingers trembling as she aligned it with the markings on the stone. She felt a surge of energy, a pulse that seemed to reverberate through her very bones. The orb in her satchel vibrated softly, as if responding to the energy that had begun to stir in the air. The ground beneath her feet shifted slightly, as if the earth were awakening. The pendant's light intensified, its spiral blazing like a beacon. Calliope held her breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The island had been waiting for this, for someone to unlock its secrets, to follow the path that had been set so long ago. With a final, deliberate motion, she placed the orb at the center of the altar. The moment it made contact with the stone, the air crackled with energy. The symbols on the stone began to glow, their lines shifting and twisting as if they were alive. Calliope stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest as the altar seemed to open before her, revealing a hidden compartment deep within the stone. Inside was a small, intricately carved box, its surface covered in the same spirals and markings that had guided her this far. She opened it slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Inside was an ancient scroll, its edges frayed and worn by time. The ink on its surface was faded, but Calliope could still make out the familiar symbols, the language of the gods. It was the final piece, the answer to the question that had haunted her since the beginning. The scroll held the key to understanding the love story that had bound the lovers to the island, the curse that had kept them apart, and the power that now flowed through Calliope's own veins. The wind stirred around her, the sea below churning as if in anticipation. The scroll's ancient words filled her mind, the meaning becoming clearer with each passing moment. Calliope knew now that her journey was far from over, but the path was clear. The past had called to her, and she had answered. But the story of the lovers, the story of the island, was far from finished. It was only just beginning. Chapter 10. The Unbroken Circle. Calliope stood still before the altar, the scroll in her hands feeling both heavy and light, as though it contained both the weight of centuries and the fragile nature of the present. Her heart beat steadily, but within her, a storm of thoughts churned, answers that had come too quickly and those that remained tantalizingly out of reach. The words of the ancient text echoed in her mind like a song half remembered, their meaning threading through her consciousness like a ribbon. She could feel the power of the island surrounding her, the whispers of its past rising from the stones, the sea, and the wind. The key had unlocked something far deeper than she had anticipated, and now it was as if the entire island was watching her. The air was thick with anticipation, and she could not shake the feeling that something monumental was approaching. The scroll's words spoke of a bond, unyielding and unbroken, forged in love, but also in pain. It told the tale of a curse that had bound the island's first inhabitants in eternal separation, a curse that had been passed down through the ages. And now, the curse was coming to a head once again, its threads converging with Calliope's own fate. She held the scroll closer, her eyes scanning its delicate text. Her mind raced through the fragments of the story, piecing together what she had already learned from her journey. The two lovers, ancient souls bound by a force as old as time itself, had been torn apart by betrayal, their love transformed into something darker, more powerful than any of them had intended. The curse that had kept them apart was not simply a punishment. It was a trap, a mechanism to ensure their love would never find peace, never be fulfilled. But the curse had a loophole, and the scroll spoke of it, of someone who would come to the island, a chosen one, whose love would be the key to breaking the chains that had held the lovers' souls in torment for centuries. Calliope's breath caught in her throat. She understood now. The curse was not just about the lovers. It was about the island itself, and the circle that had been formed by their separation. It was a circle that had never been broken, a cycle that had turned for generations, each time resetting the stage for new souls to come, suffer, and repeat the pattern. And now, it seemed, Calliope was to be the one to bring that cycle to an end. The wind picked up again, tugging at her tunic and the edges of her hair, as if to pull her into action. But there was no rush, no sudden urgency. The island was not forcing her, but rather, it was waiting. The choice was hers to make, as it had always been for those who came before her. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and Calliope turned toward the sea, her gaze following the waves as they crashed against the jagged cliffs. The water shimmered, its surface reflecting the colors of the fading sun, and for a moment, she wondered if the sea could speak, if it could tell her the secrets it had held for so long. But the silence remained, stretching out in front of her like the endless horizon. She stepped away from the altar, the scroll still clutched tightly in her hands. The forest around her was unchanged, the trees standing as silent sentinels, their branches heavy with the weight of their own histories. She knew now that she would need to return to the village, to the heart of the place where this all began. There was something there, something hidden in plain sight, that would give her the final piece to break the curse. The path back seemed clearer now, as though the island itself had shifted, guiding her steps. The weight of the journey had not diminished, but the uncertainty had lessened. She moved through the forest with more purpose, the symbols on the stones etched into her memory, each one marking the stages of a journey that was nearly complete. As she walked, the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the world in hues of gold and crimson. The shadows grew longer, stretching across the ground like fingers reaching toward her, urging her forward. The village lay ahead, its quiet, humble presence almost comforting. But Calliope knew that nothing would be the same once she returned. The key had been found, the curse revealed, and now she had to face it. The past was a living thing, breathing in the wind and the rustling leaves, waiting to be acknowledged. But to acknowledge it was to face the truth of what had been lost, the lover's pain, the island's grief, and the sacrifice that would be demanded. She reached the outskirts of the village, her heart steady but her mind alert. The houses were dark now, their windows glowing softly with the light of candles. It was a quiet, peaceful evening, but beneath the stillness, Calliope could sense the tension, as if the entire village was holding its breath, waiting for her return. She passed through the narrow streets, her steps echoing softly against the cobblestones. She did not stop, did not look back. The time for hesitation had passed. The curse had been set in motion long before her arrival, and now she was the one who would either break it or allow it to continue, stretching on through eternity. As she reached the center of the village, she saw the familiar shape of the small church standing at the edge of the square, its stone walls weathered but strong. It was there, she knew, that the final pieces of the puzzle would fall into place. The church, the place of worship, had been the site of the first betrayal, the place where the curse had taken root. It was here that the souls of the lovers had been torn apart, their love twisted into something darker. And it was here that the circle would be broken. Calliope took a deep breath and stepped toward the church, the night air cool against her skin. The doors, weathered by time and use, creaked as she pushed them open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and incense. The silence was deep, profound, and it welcomed her like a shroud. She stepped inside, the heavy doors closing behind her with a soft thud, sealing her into the space where the past and present would meet. There, in the stillness, she would find the answer. The final piece that would allow her to break the circle and free the lovers, to end the curse that had haunted this island for far too long. Chapter 11. The Heart of the Stone. The darkness inside the church was absolute. Even the faint glow of the moon could not penetrate the thick walls of the ancient stone structure. Calliope felt as though she had stepped into another world, one where time had no meaning, where the past and present existed simultaneously. The silence in the air was oppressive, like a living thing, pressing down on her shoulders, filling her lungs, suffocating her thoughts. The church had not changed since the first time she had walked its hollowed halls, but now everything seemed different, heavier, more real, as though the years of dust and neglect had suddenly come to life, revealing hidden truths that had long been sealed away. The familiar stone pillars rose up from the floor like silent guardians, their surfaces worn by centuries of devotion. The stained glass windows, though cracked and faded, still shimmered with the remnants of long-forgotten colors. At the far end of the church, the altar stood, draped in shadows. The altar was not just a place of worship. It was a place of history, of sorrow. Calliope could feel it now, the weight of the tragedies that had unfolded here. The curse had begun here, where the lovers had been torn apart, their souls bound by forces they could never understand. The stone beneath her feet seemed to hum with the echoes of their pain, their love, their betrayal. The stones, the walls, the very air in this place held memories, and Calliope knew that it was time to confront them. The scroll she had found, the one that had unlocked the island's secrets, had led her here, but there was more. There was something else in this place, a hidden truth that was not written in the ancient text, a truth that could only be discovered through action, through courage. She could feel it now, the stirring of something deep within the walls of the church. The key she had discovered was not a physical object, it was a metaphor, a force that had always been a part of her. The island had chosen her for this moment, and she had to trust in the path that had been laid before her. Calliope's eyes moved over the altar, lingering on the intricately carved stonework. She had been here before, but tonight it felt as though the altar were speaking to her. The symbols etched into its surface were more than mere decoration. They were a map, a guide, a message left behind by the first inhabitants of the island. The lovers' spirits had left their mark on this place, their love and pain forever woven into the fabric of the stone. She stepped forward, drawn toward the altar, her feet light but her heart heavy. Each step seemed to reverberate through the stillness, the echo of her footfalls like a pulse in the night. The energy in the air shifted as she moved closer, a subtle vibration that seemed to radiate from the stone itself. Her hand reached out, almost instinctively, and brushed against the cool surface of the altar. The moment her fingers made contact, a sudden rush of energy surged through her, overwhelming her senses. The ground beneath her seemed to tremble, and for a brief moment, the walls of the church appeared to fade, dissolving into a haze of light. She blinked, her eyes trying to adjust to the surreal vision before her. In the center of the altar, the stone split open, revealing a hidden compartment that had been sealed for centuries. Inside, bathed in an ethereal light, was a large, smooth stone, its surface glowing faintly. Calliope recognized it immediately. It was the heart of the stone, the key to breaking the curse. It was not an object she could hold, but rather a presence, a force. The stone was alive, its energy thrumming with ancient power, as if it had been waiting for her to arrive. Her heart raced as she reached for it, her fingers trembling with anticipation. The moment her touch made contact with the stone, the church seemed to come alive. The walls groaned, the floor creaked, and the air thickened, charged with the intensity of the moment. The spirits of the lovers, once trapped in the limbo of the island, seemed to stir, their energy swirling around her. It was as though the island itself had awakened, and now it was waiting, watching, to see if she would succeed. Calliope closed her eyes, focusing on the energy pulsing from the stone. She could feel its power deep within her, as if the very fabric of her being was resonating with the heartbeat of the island. The heart of the stone was not just a key. It was the culmination of everything that had come before. The lovers' souls, the curse, the island's history. All of it was intertwined, and now she had to release it. She had to break the cycle that had bound them to this place. The vision of the lovers flickered in her mind, two figures, their faces shrouded in shadow, their hands reaching for one another but unable to touch. Their love had been a force as strong as the stone itself, and their separation had torn at the very fabric of the world. The curse had been a bond, but it had also been a prison, a trap that had kept them apart. Now, with the heart of the stone in her hands, Calliope had the power to free them. She whispered the words of the scroll in her mind, though they had no voice. She did not need to speak aloud. The power was within her, and it was time to let it flow. The stone beneath her hand began to glow brighter, its energy filling the church, vibrating with a force so strong that it seemed to reach out beyond the walls, beyond the island. The curse, the cycle, began to unravel, its threads coming loose one by one. The love that had been twisted into a torment was now being freed, unbound, set loose into the air. For a moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. The stone, the church, the island, all were still. And then, with a sound like a sigh, the walls seemed to exhale, the energy of the island settling into a calm, peaceful silence. The heart of the stone dimmed, its glow fading into the darkness, but the power remained. It was done. The curse was broken. Calliope stepped back from the altar, her breath coming in slow, deep inhalations. Her heart was still pounding, but it was a different rhythm now, one of peace, of release. The island, once filled with tension and pain, now felt lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted. The lovers' souls were no longer trapped. They were free. She felt a deep sense of connection, as though the island had embraced her, thanking her for what she had done. The stone, the altar, the church, they all seemed to hum with the quiet resonance of a promise fulfilled. Calliope knew that she had done what was needed, but there was more. There was a life to be lived now, a future to be shaped. The island's secrets had been revealed, and in doing so, it had given her a chance to step into a new world. As the first rays of dawn broke through the church's stained glass windows, casting colorful beams of light across the stone floor, Calliope knew that she had not only freed the lovers, but she had freed herself as well. The heart of the stone had been opened, and the world was waiting. Chapter 12. The Dawn of Forever. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground, a contrast to the peace that had settled over the island. Calliope stood at the edge of the church, her silhouette framed against the warm glow of the horizon. The air was crisp, but there was a softness to it now, a gentleness that had not been there before. It was as though the land itself was breathing with her, its pulse now aligned with hers. She stood still for a moment, the stone of the church cool beneath her fingertips, her heart calm in a way it had never been before. The silence was no longer oppressive, but serene, as if the world had held its breath and now allowed itself to exhale in unison. The curse, the past, all of it seemed distant now, its weight lifted, its purpose fulfilled. Calliope turned her gaze toward the sea, the waves rolling gently onto the shore, their rhythm steady and timeless. The sound of the ocean had always been a lullaby for the island, a constant reminder of the forces that shaped its shores. But now, it felt different, brighter, as though the waves themselves carried a promise of something new, something beginning. It was not just the island that had changed. It was she who had been transformed. She had not expected the ending to come with such stillness. There had been no grand crescendo, no final declaration to mark the moment of victory. But perhaps that was how the true endings always arrived, quietly, without fanfare, as if everything that had come before was simply a preparation for this moment. The release, the freedom, was in the simplicity of the present. The lovers' souls were at rest, their bond no longer a curse, but a story of love and sacrifice that had found its closure. And so too had her own journey. She had come to the island a stranger, an outsider, uncertain of her place in its history, in its fate. She had been drawn in by the whispers of an ancient curse, but what she had found was so much more than she could have ever imagined. In freeing the lovers, she had freed herself. The island had not only offered its secrets, it had offered its heart. And now, as she stood on the threshold of a new day, Calliope understood that this island, these people, and this love would be her foundation. They would be her guide as she stepped into the future. Turning from the church, Calliope made her way down the winding path that led through the village. The buildings, now bathed in the soft light of the morning, looked different, more alive than they had the day before. The earth beneath her feet felt solid, and yet there was a lightness to her steps, a buoyancy she hadn't known existed. She was free, and so the island was free. As she walked, her thoughts wandered back to the beginning of her journey, to the day she had first arrived, unaware of the weight she carried or the destiny that awaited her. It had been a place of shadows, of secrets kept in the corners of the village and the hearts of its people. But now, the village felt open, welcoming, as if the very air was different, lighter, warmer. The people of the village, who had once been bound by the same curse, now lived in the quiet peace that had settled over the island. They did not know the details of Calliope's journey, of the lovers she had freed, but they felt it. They felt the change in the wind, in the way the sun rose with a gentler light, in the way the sea seemed to sing a different tune. At the heart of the village, she found herself drawn once again to the small, quiet garden by the edge of the square. There, beneath a flowering tree, the memory of the lovers seemed to linger. Calliope could almost see them, two figures, their forms glowing faintly in the morning light, standing side by side. Their souls had been freed, and yet their love remained, as eternal as the island itself. Their presence, though unseen, was still felt, a subtle reminder of the strength of love, of the sacrifices that had been made, of the bonds that could never truly be broken. As Calliope stood beneath the tree, she placed a hand against its trunk, feeling the rough bark beneath her fingers. The tree, like the stone, had seen generations pass. Its roots ran deep, its branches stretched toward the sky. It had witnessed the village's history, its joys and sorrows, and now it stood as a symbol of what had been and what was yet to come. It was the island's heart, just as she had become its own. The breeze picked up, and for a brief moment, she closed her eyes, allowing the wind to brush against her skin. It felt as though the island itself was whispering to her, telling her that her place was here, not just as an outsider, but as a part of its story, woven into its fabric, just as the lovers had once been. She was no longer a stranger to this land. She had become a part of it, and it had become a part of her. Her gaze lifted toward the horizon once more, and she could see the mountains in the distance, their peaks rising above the clouds. The path before her was still unclear, but for the first time in her life, she felt ready to walk it. There would be no more searching for answers, no more looking back at the past. The future was a canvas, waiting for her to paint it with her own hands, to shape it with the choices she would make. The village, the sea, the sky, it was all hers now. The island had given her its heart, and in return, she had given it hers. The love that had once been bound by time, by pain, by fate, was now free. And so too was she, free to live, free to love, free to become. As the sun climbed higher, its light spilling across the land, Calliope walked forward, her heart open, her spirit unburdened. The circle had been broken, but in its place had been forged something far greater, the beginning of forever. Chapter 13. The Tides of Time. The island stretched before Calliope, an expanse of land that seemed infinite in its quiet beauty. With each step, she felt more connected to its pulse, as though the earth itself was speaking to her. The village behind her was still and peaceful, but the world ahead was different. She could feel the weight of history in the air, the deep roots of the past pulling at her, reminding her that though she had freed the island from its curse, there were still pieces of the story that needed to be understood. The lovers were free, but she, too, was a part of their story, bound by forces she had yet to comprehend. Her feet carried her toward the cliffs, where the land met the endless blue of the Aegean Sea. The wind was sharp here, tossing her hair about her face, its salt-laden breath invigorating her senses. The ocean stretched out before her, an unbroken line of blue that seemed to merge with the sky in the distance. The sight was breathtaking, as always, yet now it felt different, bigger, more expansive. She was standing at the edge of the world, at the crossroads of the past and the future. Calliope paused for a moment, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The sea had always been a symbol of eternity to her, its tides ebbing and flowing with the rhythm of the world. Time itself seemed to be written in the waves, their endless motion a reminder that nothing could ever truly be still. Yet now, standing before it, she realized that the island had been timeless long before her arrival. It had witnessed centuries of change, of love, of loss. And yet, it had remained unchanged, like the sea itself, flowing and reflowing, the currents of its fate pulling it toward an unknown future. The tides of time seemed to call to her, their rhythmic pull a beckoning force. She could almost hear the whispers of those who had come before her, their voices carried on the wind, asking for her to understand what had been lost. The island had been shaped by the hands of many, those who had loved, those who had fought, those who had bled for its land. It was their memories that had shaped this place, just as it was now shaping her. Calliope's heart ached as she thought of all that had been lost. The lovers, bound by a curse, their love never allowed to bloom fully, never allowed to find peace. She had broken the chains that had bound them, but what of the other lost souls who had once walked this land? What of the generations that had come before her, whose sacrifices had built the foundation of this place? She had freed the spirits of the past, but in doing so, she had only just begun to understand the depth of their story. Her thoughts turned toward the village, its quiet streets now empty in the early morning light. There had been little celebration for the freedom she had given to the island. Perhaps, in time, the villagers would come to understand the gravity of what had happened. But for now, there was only silence, a silence that felt like a waiting breath. The island had been freed, but it was also waiting for the next chapter of its story to unfold, waiting for the final pieces to fall into place. She turned her back on the ocean and began walking again, her feet carrying her through the winding path that led deeper into the island. The trees here were ancient, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their roots buried deep beneath the soil. They seemed to speak of the passage of time, of the countless seasons they had witnessed, of the stories they had absorbed. The island was alive with the memories of the past, and each step she took seemed to bring her closer to the heart of its truth. As she walked, she came upon a clearing, where the light filtered through the canopy of leaves and golden shafts. In the center of the clearing stood a stone monument, weathered by time but still standing firm. It was a simple structure, unadorned, but there was something about it that caught Calliope's attention. She approached it slowly, her hand instinctively reaching for the cold stone surface. The monument felt different from the rest of the island. It had been placed here deliberately, a marker of something that had once been. The stone was smooth, its edges worn by the years, but the symbols etched into it were still clear, their meaning unmistakable. These were not the symbols of the lovers or the curse, but something else, something older. The markings seemed to pulse with a quiet energy, as though they held the secrets of the island's earliest inhabitants. The stones spoke of a time before the curse, before the lovers, before the island's isolation. Calliope's breath caught in her throat as she realized what this monument represented. It was a memorial to the forgotten, the people who had lived on this island long before the curse had taken root, the ones who had built it, who had loved it, who had shaped its history in ways she could never fully understand. They were the true ancestors of the island, and though their names had been lost to time, their spirits still lingered here, in the stones, in the trees, in the very earth beneath her feet. The realization struck her with a force she hadn't expected. She had come here seeking answers, seeking to free the lovers, but now she understood that there was so much more to the island than just their story. The curse had been a part of it, yes, but it was not the whole story. The island's true history was buried deep within its roots, woven into the fabric of its existence. The lovers were just one chapter, and their love had been the key to unlocking the rest. Calliope stood before the monument, her fingers resting lightly against the stone. The weight of the past pressed on her, but it was not a burden. No, it was a gift. The island had given her a glimpse into its soul, into the depths of its history, and now she was a part of it. The lovers' spirits had found peace, but their story was just one part of the endless tapestry that was the island's legacy. And now, she too, was woven into it. Her mind swirled with the knowledge of the past, of the island's ancient truths, but she knew that there was still more to be discovered. The tides of time were ever-changing, and though she had uncovered much, she had not yet reached the end of the story. The island had more to teach her, and she would stay here until she had learned everything it had to offer. The sun was rising higher now, its light spilling across the clearing in a blaze of golden warmth. It seemed to shine on the monument, illuminating its ancient carvings, revealing their secrets for the first time in centuries. The island had waited for this moment, for the right person to arrive, for the right soul to unlock its truth. And now, that person was her. Calliope took a deep breath and stepped back from the stone, her heart swelling with a deep, quiet sense of purpose. The winds shifted around her, and she could feel the island's voice, gentle and persistent, calling her to continue, to learn more, to understand. The tides of time would not stop for her, nor for anyone, but they would guide her, and she would follow. Chapter 14. The Heart of the Island. The wind had changed once again, and with it came a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Calliope could feel it in the air. The island, in its infinite patience, was drawing her closer to the heart of its mysteries. There were places on this island, hidden beneath the layers of time and silence, that had not yet revealed themselves. Yet, she knew, deep in her bones, that she was destined to find them. The lovers were free, the curse was broken, but something remained. Something vital. Something that had always been there, just out of reach, waiting for the right moment. Calliope stood at the edge of a thick, ancient forest. The trees here were older than any she had seen on the island, their trunks towering and twisted, their branches a canopy so dense that the sunlight barely pierced through. The air was cool, tinged with the earthy scent of moss and leaves. There was a quiet here, a profound stillness, as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to enter. And enter she did. Her footsteps were muffled against the soft earth, and as she moved deeper into the woods, the light around her dimmed, swallowed by the thick foliage above. The forest seemed to breathe with her, its pulse steady and strong, like a living thing. She had ventured into the wilderness before, but this place felt different. There was an ancient energy here, one that called to her in ways she could not fully understand. It was as though the forest itself was conscious, aware of her presence, aware of her purpose. The deeper she ventured, the more the island seemed to open up to her. The trees whispered with the wind, their leaves rustling softly, and Calliope could swear she heard them speaking, though their words were beyond comprehension. It was the language of the land, a language she had begun to understand in her time on the island. The forest was alive with stories, with the weight of centuries, with secrets hidden in the very soil beneath her feet. There was a clearing ahead, and she felt herself drawn toward it. The trees seemed to part before her, guiding her steps, as though the forest itself was leading her to the place she needed to be. As she emerged into the open space, she was met by a sight that took her breath away. In the center of the clearing stood a stone structure, old and worn, but still standing firm. It was not large, but its presence was undeniable. The stone was unlike any she had seen on the island before, smooth and almost glowing in the dappled light that filtered through the trees. The structure was simple, yet its design held a beauty that spoke of a time long past. It was a monument of sorts, but not one built for the lovers or for any recent history. This was something far older, a relic from a forgotten age, and it pulsed with a quiet power that Calliope could feel in her chest. She approached it slowly, reverently, her heart racing with anticipation. The stone was cold beneath her fingertips as she reached out to touch it. The moment her hand made contact, a surge of energy rushed through her, as though the stone had been waiting for her touch. It was a sensation unlike any she had ever felt, an electric hum that seemed to resonate with the very marrow of her bones. It was as though the island itself had recognized her, as though it had been waiting for this moment. As her fingers traced the surface of the stone, she felt the weight of its history, the depth of its purpose. The carvings on the stone were intricate and strange, symbols she did not fully recognize but somehow understood. They spoke of a time before the curse, before the lovers, before the island had become a place of sorrow and silence. This monument was not just a relic. It was a key, a doorway to something deeper, something that had been hidden away for centuries. Calliope stepped back, her breath shallow as she tried to make sense of what she had just experienced. She had felt the island's heartbeat, the pull of its ancient power, and now she understood that this was the heart of the island, the place where its true essence lay. It was here, in this forgotten corner, that the island's spirit had been kept safe, hidden from the world, waiting for someone to unlock its secrets. The wind shifted again, and as if in response to the movement, the stone seemed to respond. A low rumble echoed through the ground, and the earth beneath her feet seemed to tremble. For a moment, she feared the stone might collapse, or that the very island itself might reject her. But instead, the rumble subsided, and in its place came a soft, melodic sound, a hum that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It was not a voice, not a spoken word, but something more profound. It was a song, ancient and beautiful, a lullaby of the earth, sung in a language she could not understand, but one that filled her with an overwhelming sense of belonging. The sound swirled around her, wrapping her in its warmth, and for the first time, she felt truly at home. The island had accepted her, had welcomed her into its heart, and now she was a part of it. The lover's story, the curse, the battles, the losses, they had all led her to this moment. She was no longer an outsider. She was a part of the island's legacy, woven into its very fabric. She stood there for what seemed like hours, lost in the music of the land, her mind swirling with the realization that her journey had not ended, but had only just begun. The island had more to offer her, more to teach her, and now she had the keys to unlock its mysteries. As the hum of the earth slowly faded, Calliope took a deep breath and stepped away from the stone. She knew that the island had revealed to her what she needed to understand. It had shown her the heart of its power, its spirit, and its eternal connection to those who walked upon it. The wind began to pick up once again, carrying with it the scent of the sea, of salt and earth, of timelessness. The island was breathing with her, guiding her steps, whispering secrets in the language of the land. There was no turning back now. She had discovered the heart of the island, and in doing so, she had discovered her own. With a final glance at the monument, Calliope turned and began walking back through the forest. The path ahead was still uncertain, but now she was ready. She had found her place, and as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden light over the trees, she knew that this was only the beginning of the story. The island had shown her its heart. Now, it was her turn to show the world what she had discovered. Chapter 15. The Song of Forever. As Calliope emerged from the dense shadows of the forest, the island seemed to greet her with a final, sweeping embrace. The evening air was alive with the scent of the sea, the cool breeze carrying whispers of the ocean's eternal song. It was as though the island, in its quiet splendor, had come full circle, revealing all its secrets and mysteries, and now, in its last act, it offered a gift, one that could never be fully understood, only felt in the deepest recesses of the soul. The sun, having begun its descent into the horizon, bathed the land in a warm, golden light. The sky was a canvas of deep oranges and purples, the colors of twilight wrapping themselves around the island as though to protect it, to shelter it in this final moment. Calliope stood at the edge of the cliffs, looking out over the vast expanse of the sea, the waves crashing below, the sound of the ocean like the beating of a heart. The island, she realized, had never truly been silent. It had been waiting, always waiting, for someone to listen. Her heart was heavy with the knowledge that this was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. She had uncovered the mysteries, healed the wounds of the past, and set the spirits of the island free. But in doing so, she had become part of something much greater. The island, in its timeless existence, was a living being, its heart intertwined with hers. And now, she carried its song within her, its history, its dreams, its love. The wind shifted, carrying with it the soft echo of a melody. At first, she thought it was nothing more than the distant call of the sea, the sigh of the wind through the trees. But as the sound grew louder, clearer, she realized it was something more, a song. The song of the island. A song of love, of loss, of the eternal dance between the earth and the sky. It was the island's heart, its essence, its very soul, speaking directly to her. The song was sweet, aching, and beautiful, a harmony that resonated with the deepest parts of her being. It was a lullaby, a hymn to the land, a melody that would never fade, but would echo through eternity. In that moment, Calliope understood. The island had been waiting for someone to carry its song forward. Someone who could hear its call, someone who could feel its pulse, someone who could understand its quiet, timeless beauty. She was that someone. She had always been. It was why she had come here, why she had been drawn to this place, to this island, to this love. It was all part of the same rhythm, the same eternal flow. The sea below sparkled in the fading light, its waves crashing with the rhythm of the song. Calliope closed her eyes, her heart beating in sync with the melody. She breathed deeply, taking in the air, the scents, the sounds, letting it all fill her, becoming one with it. There was no need for words, no need for explanation. She understood now, in the way that only the heart can understand. The island had taught her everything it could. It had given her the gift of its song, and in return, she would carry it forward, share it with the world, let it live on. As the final rays of the sun dipped beneath the horizon, the song began to fade, slowly, like a distant memory. But even as the sounds of the island became quieter, Calliope knew that it would never truly end. The song was not bound by time. It was not confined to the limits of the world. It would live forever, in the hearts of those who could hear it, in the souls of those who could feel its rhythm. She turned away from the edge of the cliff, her heart full, her spirit at peace. The island had given her everything it could, and now it was time for her to leave. But not in the way she had once thought. She was not leaving behind a part of herself. She was carrying it with her, wrapped in the song of the island, in the love of the land, in the magic of its timeless existence. She would never truly leave. As she walked back toward the heart of the island, she knew that her journey had reached its conclusion. But it was not the end. It was simply another beginning, a new chapter, a new song. And though she would never return to this place in the same way again, the island would always be with her, echoing in her heart, in the rhythm of her steps, in the melody of her life. She had discovered the heart of the island. She had listened to its song, felt its pulse, and in doing so, had become part of it. She would carry it with her always. And as the last light of the day faded into the night, Calliope smiled, knowing that she had found what she had been searching for all along. The love of the island, the song of the earth, and the forever that echoed in the silence between each note. The song of forever.